Thank you very much for being here tonight. Welcome to Budget Chaos in Context, Fiscal Lessons Learned for a Challenging Future. My name is Chase Hageman. I'm the New England Regional Director for the Concord Coalition. Concord's a nonpartisan organization that educates on the importance of responsible federal fiscal policy. And we were founded by former U.S. Senators Warren Rubin and Paul Tsongas 25 years ago this year. So this event is also serving as one of our 25th anniversary celebrations. So thank you so much for being here with us. I am going to introduce our guest speakers this evening. They're going to go up on stage one at a time as I introduce them. We're going to have a moderated conversation and then open it up for a few questions toward the end of the event. So if you'd like, think of a good question to ask, and you'll probably get a chance to ask it. Senator Kent Conrad is a former Democratic U.S. Senator for the state of North Dakota. He served from 1987 to 2013. He was the Budget Committee Chairman from 2001 to 2003, and then again from 2007 to 2013. So Senator Conrad, would you join us up, please? Senator Judd Gregg is a former Republican U.S. Senator for New Hampshire. He served from 1993 to 2011, and he was the Budget Committee Chairman from 2005 to 2007. Prior to his time in the Senate, he served in the House and also as Governor of New Hampshire. And Senator Gregg is also on the Concord Coalition's National Board. So thank you so much for being here, Senator. And last but not least is Concord's own Executive Director, Robert Bixby. He has been with Concord probably since its inception 25 years ago in a variety of capacities. He's a budget policy expert and a national voice on pretty much anything fiscal policy related. So Bob, thank you so much for being here as well. And at this time, I'm actually going to hand it over to Bob, and he'll start off the conversation. So thank you very much and enjoy the program.
Okay, thank you very much, Chase. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And it's really good to see a lot of young faces in the audience, because this issue that we're talking about, fiscal responsibility, is really, if you talk about a federal budget that's on an unsustainable course, the consequences of that are more, the younger you are, the more important that issue is. Chase mentioned that this is our 25th anniversary of the Concord Coalition since 1992. We've been advocating fiscal responsibility and on a bipartisan basis. We've been advocating tough choices on spending and tax policies and keeping the debt under control. So let me start with a little bit of good news, because this usually is a bad news topic. And as I'm talking about that, about arguing for fiscal responsibility, sometimes people say, what do you do for a living? I say, well, I'm executive director of the Concord Coalition. What do they do? Oh, you argue for fiscal responsibility in Washington, and people start laughing. So, or making faces, or like, well, how's that going, So I thought that, and I understand why. That's certainly a logical reaction given recent events. But it's important to think about the whole history of the 25 years. And, when the Concord Coalition started, it was after the 92 campaign. Ross Perot had made the deficit and the debt a big issue and had done very well. And so the Clinton administration started out with a deficit reduction plan that was opposed, but it was, I think, carried by one vote. Bob Kerrey voted for it in the Senate finally. And I think Al Gore broke the tie in the Senate, and it passed narrowly in the House. Anyway, later in the decade, I remember when the Republicans took control of the Senate, in the House, there was a fight between Democrats and Republicans, almost a competition over who could come up with the balanced budget quicker. So my point is that during the 90s, the budget deficit shrunk and then turned into a surplus for 4 years, a growing surplus. So for the first 10 years or so of the Concord Coalition's existence, the budget picture did improve, and it's perhaps gone in the wrong direction since then. But what we want to talk about now, though, is not so much a nostalgia tour or a who's to blame tour, but a what do we do now? And so that's why we're delighted to call upon two of the best people to opine on that issue and to advise today's leaders and tomorrow's leaders about budget issues, because I can say on the 25 years that I've been with the Concord Coalition, never was hope higher on my part than when Judd, Gregg, and Ken Conrad were at the head of the Senate Budget Committee. These two really had a passion for and an interest, understanding of the budget issues, a commitment to a bipartisan approach. Their efforts helped bring about the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and Senator Gregg served on that commission, Senator Conrad served on that commission. I think that that was a great opportunity to have done something, and if they want to talk about that experience and how it might be replicated in the future, that would be great. But that was the point of today, is to look at the key fiscal issues going forward for the next 25 years. So let's write off the past 25 years and say, okay, if the Concord Coalition was started now, what would our mission be? So let me turn first to Senator Gregg, and what advice would you give for today's leaders? Where are we and where should we be going?
Well, Bob, first, thank you for putting together this forum, but more importantly, thank you for getting Conrad to join us here in New Hampshire. I had the honor to serve with Kent all my time in the Senate, and much of the time he was chairman of the Budget Committee, and then I'd be chairman, and he'd be chairman. And we got to be very good friends. And even though we disagreed rather intensely on some of our issues, we did it in a way that after we disagreed, we'd sit down and talk and enjoy each other's company. He always out-charted me. He would beat me 10 charts to 1 almost with regularity. It was, finally, I asked my staff to put a chart machine in the cloakroom so I could catch up with him, but we couldn't get the money for it. But what's important to know about Ken is that he is a truly dedicated individual to public service, that he represented the state of North Dakota extraordinarily well, and he really was totally committed to trying to get our fiscal house in order. We may have had different views as to how you do that, but there was no question that the number one issue, or one of the number one issues, besides being concerned about the state and the issues in the state and national foreign policy and things like that, was the threat. In fact, I quote him all the time because I use the term, the debt is the threat. And that is a Kent Conrad quote. And I don't attribute it to him anymore. I always take credit for it. But today I was teaching a course up at Dartmouth and said, the debt is the threat. I didn't follow it up with Ken Conrad. Where do we go from here? Also, I have to mention he has a wonderful wife, Lucy, who's actually much sharper, much more thoughtful, much better looking than he is. And Kathy and I, really, we love to hang out with them because we like hanging out with Lucy. What should the Concord Coalition, that's a pretty good way to put it. What should the task be for the Concord Coalition going forward? What should we do to get the deficit debt under control? First off, the parameters of this have to be mentioned, which are that we just crossed $20 trillion in debt. $20 trillion in debt. The debt to GDP ratio, which is really the benchmark of how well a nation is doing. Historically, our debt to GDP ratio was 35% up until about 2008. And then it spiked dramatically for a lot of different reasons. but primarily because of the demographic shift that occurred when the baby boomers dropped out of the workplace, stopped being contributors to reducing the debt and started being a drawdown on the debt. We also had other issues, of course. The 2008 fiscal meltdown was a massive recession, equaled only by the Great Depression. But the $20 trillion in debt is a huge number, but what's really dangerous, and it is dangerous is the right word, is the fact that we are on a path where it's still going up, where the debt to GDP ratio, which used to be about 35%, is now around 72%, but is headed towards 80%. And we're looking at returning to deficits in the range of $1 trillion a year. This year it'll be about $660 billion, which is about 3.5% of GDP. As a nation, we can handle deficits as long as they're manageable numbers. In other words, I've always felt if we kept the deficit below the rate of growth of the economy, then you may probably have a reasonable number. But we're not doing that now. So what we're doing, as Bob alluded to, is we're on the verge of passing on to our children and our grandchildren a nation that is so laden with debt that their capacity to have the same sort of prosperity that we have had will be dramatically curtailed or contracted. And that, of course, applies to all of you here who are in school and about to get out of school. And to put that in context, the service on the federal debt will be the single largest item of spending in the federal government by about the year 2022, depending on how quickly interest rates go up. And service on debt, which means paying interest, gets you nothing. It doesn't get you a road, it doesn't get you better health care, it doesn't get you a better army, it doesn't get you a better school system, it gets you nothing. It just sends money out to somebody who lends you money. And so it's an extremely inefficient and bad way to have an economy, a federal fiscal situation. So what should the goal be? Well, stabilize the debt. And Willie Sutton used to say, when he was asked why he robbed banks, he said, because that's where the money is. Well, if you're going to address the debt, you have to address three things: entitlement spending, and tax revenues, and discretionary spending. Ironically, discretionary spending has been handled very aggressively by this Congress and prior Congresses. But our entitlement accounts, specifically our healthcare accounts, are bankrupting us. And our revenue situation is that we're generating historic levels of revenue, but not enough to catch up with the spending that's being driven by the retirement of the baby boom generation. I'll stop there because Kent's going to give you a much better thought.
Well, I'll tell you that this is because Senator Gregg is on our board, we decided that we would bar charts, you see, because that would allow an even playing field, because we do charts at the Concord Coalition too, but Senator Conrad would always put us to shame with these charts of his. So we decided no charts, so it would be an even playing field.
This is a chart-free night.
Chart-free zone.
So, Bob, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. Thanks for your dedication to the cause, because it's deeply appreciated, and you've made a real commitment. And that's what's necessary to move the ball forward. Let me just say about Senator Gregg, I have enormous admiration and respect for him. When you sit next to someone day after day after day, year after year after year, helping run the budget committee, and you're of opposite parties, but you share a commitment to getting the country back on fiscal course, back on sound ground, you develop a healthy respect for each other, especially if the other person is honorable. And this guy is honorable. His word is gold, and you always knew he was absolutely committed to doing what he thought was right for the country, what he thought was right for New Hampshire. There was, he wasn't out there play acting, as we see so much of today. He wasn't out there posturing, as we see so much of today. He was seriously trying to get things solved. So I developed a very healthy respect for Judd Gregg, and we worked together very hard to put together the Simpson-Bowles Commission. We served on it, and we really were the architects of it. We're the ones that came up with the idea for it. We're the ones that got it put in
Tell the
place.
story of how we developed it.
Well, we were on a trip to South America, and Kathy and Judd.
The swearing in of the president of Bolivia.
This is beginning to sound like Butch Cassidy or something.
Well, almost. I mean, it sort of had the
Oh,
same
in the same way, yes.
So, Judd and his wife Kathy were seated across from Lucy and me on this multi-day trip, and Judd and I spent most of the time talking about our deep concern about where the country was headed, the explosion of debt, the unsustainable nature of it, and how over time, not immediately, this is a very important point, but over time, it would threaten the security of the country. Because when you have too much debt, it affects the choices you have as a nation. And in our judgment, we were rapidly approaching that point. Judd, I won't repeat what Judd said about debt levels. He, of course, is exactly right. The gross debt, which is all of the debt, he was just referring to the publicly held debt. The gross debt, which includes the debt we owe to the trust funds of the United States, is 100% of GDP. There's almost no serious economist that wouldn't say that's too high. Because if, God forbid, you have another financial calamity or some other kind of calamity, for example, a war, having a debt of that magnitude limits your options, limits your choices, limits your ability to handle a crisis. Think what would have happened back in 2008 when we were on the brink of a depression if we had not had the running room to do what was necessary to get us back on track. So these numbers, and they're not just numbers on a page, they're things that really matter. They really affect people's lives. And the young people in this room, it really affects your lives more than those of us who are a little older, maybe in our case much older, because this is going to affect your country that you're going to be running, and you're going to be running very soon. So what do we do about it? I was asked at an event yesterday, what's necessary? And my answer is leadership. What we desperately need are leaders who, number one, understand this issue, understand the threat it poses to the country. Judd is quite right. The debt is the threat. To me, there's no question about that. And so our leaders need to stand up, explain that, and offer the people a plan, a way out. That's what we tried to do in Bowles-Simpson. And you know, I'll never forget, I'll end on this note, when we were the morning of the vote in Bowles-Simpson, Simpson-Bowles, I had my staff in, and I asked them all to recommend to me how to vote. We went right around the room. Every single one of them said vote no. And I said, because they were worried about my political future, and they knew voting for this is probably not going to be popular, because one thing you learn in politics, when you start making choices, you start losing friends, okay? And a lot of people put their arm around you and say, Ken, I'm all for you. Oh, but I had no idea you were going to cut that or raise my taxes. And Bowles-Simpson did all of that. A lot of very controversial things. In fact, you know, there's something on every page of it I hated. But as I said to my staff, the only thing worse than being for this is being against it. Yeah, I understand the political controversy. But you know what? Our country is in danger. Not immediate danger. Not going to happen right now. But if you look over the horizon, our country is headed for trouble. And the question we've got to ask ourselves is, when are we going to do something about it? This is a chance. And this chance may not come again anytime soon. So I tell you what, I'm going in there and I'm voting for it. And I pray to God that enough of our colleagues have this same epiphany that they go in and vote for it, because we, in one stroke, could get this country back headed in the right direction. So yes, there are things I don't like. You know, I would be considered probably financially a moderate to conservative Democrat. Judd is a Republican. Lots of things he must have hated in it too. But one thing we liked about it a lot was that this could help us get back on track. And what a gift that would be to the country. And of all the regrets I have, I've served in the Senate 26 years, was our inability to convince our colleagues to do this deed. So, leadership.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that, because you're absolutely right, Ken. It is an issue of leadership. And leadership doesn't mean, it's interesting, in our system, which is a checks and balances system, it's not a parliamentary system. Occasionally you have parliamentary structure, like the first 2 years of President Obama had a parliamentary structure because he had 60 votes in the Senate, but that's rare. It is a checks and balance system that requires compromise. And for the American people to accept the type of changes that would have to occur, and they wouldn't be detrimental in the sense that they'd be draconian. They would be incremental changes in the entitlement area, especially in Medicare, which is the primary driver of the health care costs, and in the tax policy area, which means basic tax reform. You have to have fairness. The American people won't accept anything that they don't think is fair. And fairness in our system is defined by bipartisanship. That's what if people see something's bipartisan, they decide, well, that's fair. And so the genius of Simpson-Bowles was that it ended up being a bipartisan solution. But the reason it went forward was because there were people who were willing to take leadership roles and step on the toes of their constituencies. You don't get anything done by stepping on the toes of your opponent's constituencies, because it's presumed you're going to do that. You got to step on the toes of your constituencies and say, yeah, we got to make some tough choices here, and these tough choices are going to affect you on issues that are important to you. So leadership is about coming forward, reaching a compromise agreement, because nothing that's not compromised is going to work well in this country, as Obamacare proved, and then moving forward in a way where people are willing to step out and take the heat for getting something done with their constituencies. And right now we don't have that, unfortunately.
When you were chairing and ranking member of the Budget Committee, it fell on you to try to help to educate your fellow senators on these issues, before Simpson-Bowles. Were there misperceptions, misconceptions, myths, things that you found even among your fellow committee members or fellow senators in the broader Senate that you had to constantly keep pushing against?
One thing we did when Judd and I were at the helm of the Budget Committee is we held hearing after hearing after hearing on this subject from lots of different perspectives, trying to help our colleagues understand, number one, how big the hole was that was being dug and what the consequences of allowing it to grow would be. And so we did that a lot. Now, Judd and I, Republican, I'm a Democrat, we had some aggressive disagreements on how to solve this problem, as you can imagine, right? So we had some shall we say, animated conversations. But one thing we really agreed on, we were joined at the hip, was this is a fundamental threat to the country. And again, not in the short term. And this is what makes it so difficult politically, but longer term. When you allow this debt to accumulate, it's so interesting. I don't know if you noticed, the finance minister of Germany just announced his resignation. And what was his word to the German people? That debt globally is growing too rapidly and threatens the economic future of the industrialized nations of the world. This is the German finance minister. His warning. And of course, German debt is not dissimilar from ours. You know, Japan's the leader. They've got the highest debt as a share of their economy. We're not in that category, but we're rapidly getting into the top rank of debt holders in the world. And he's warning his people that the accumulation of debt threatens the economic future of all of us. Well, he's right. So when we were working together on these issues, we tried our best to educate first our colleagues on the budget committee. Because I can tell you, these are not sexy issues. You know, the news media aren't particularly interested in it because it's a hard story to cover. It's easy to make mistakes because there are a lot of numbers. And a lot of reporters don't like, you know, math. Any reporters?
Four-letter word.
But that's the hard reality. So, you know, I found on my final speech on the floor of the Senate was saying to my Democratic colleagues, you say we can't touch Medicare or Social Security. Really? If we would just change trajectory by 2%, we would make a profound difference in where we wound up. And to my Republican friends who say, oh, you can't raise taxes. You can't raise taxes. Really? If we just change that by 2%, I call it the 2% solution, we would dramatically change where we wind up. So to my Democratic friends, if you're going to take the position you can't touch the entitlements, which are headed for insolvency, and by the way, what's going to happen in 2034 when Social Security is insolvent? What's going to happen? Do you know what's going to happen? Everybody's going to take a 23% cut. That's what's going to happen. And by the way, it's not going to be 2034. It's probably going to be 2030 or 2029 when Social Security can no longer meet all of its obligations. And at that point, the law says everybody takes a proportional cut, 23%. Think what that's going to mean to people who've been counted. The 1/3 of Americans whose sole income in retirement is Social Security. 23% cut. Think of what's going to happen if we continue to pile up this debt and can't meet our obligations. And Medicare can't be funded. I mean, these are choices that we make today that are going to affect how people live tomorrow. And we better get serious about it. And I would just conclude on this. You know, when I watch this national debate today, it is embarrassing. Absolutely embarrassing. We're talking about the IQ of the Secretary of State. We're talking about what bathroom you go to. I mean, really? I mean, we can't talk about the things that fundamentally determine how people are going to live in the future. We can't have a serious discussion about serious things. We got to be running off, chasing the latest tweet, and I mean, honestly, we're better than this.
Well, you're absolutely right. Just to follow up on how does this all end if we don't get this under control? How it all ends is maybe 2030, Social Security hits the wall, and that's enough of a crisis to force the Congress to face up to the problem. But
That's a long way off.
yeah, it's a long way off, and I'm honestly not sure that they would even then. I think they'd probably paper it over with more debt. When it really is going to hit the wall and there will be a crisis of inordinate proportions is when somebody in the world, some country probably, some sovereign wealth fund, wakes up some morning, goes in, types in, turns on their computer, which is probably on their wrists, and says to themselves, they can't pay us back. They can't pay us back all this money we've lent them without paying us in dollars that are worth less than what we lent them. And at that point, you hit the same type of crisis that Greece hit, where essentially people have no confidence in your ability to repay in the dollars you paid them, and so they radically increase your interest rates, and the death spiral accelerates at a rate that you can't catch your own tail on the payment of your debt. That's when your economic crisis kicks in, for sure. And it will come. It's like the sun coming up in the morning. You cannot continue to ramp up debt at the rate that we're ramping it up and not have at some point somebody who's fairly analytical, who's in charge of lending you the money, suddenly say, they can't pay me back in the dollars I lent them. They're going to have to inflate their economy probably, and I'm going to get less back, and so I've got to raise my interest rates dramatically, and then the whole cycle kicks off at amazing rates. Even in today's economy, every 25 basis points that the Fed raises the interest rates on, and they should be raising interest rates in my opinion, every 25 basis points they raise the rates costs us $425 billion in new interest charges. So they've now had two rate increases. They'll probably end up with at least 4. That's over $1.5 trillion of new interest service charges. Accelerate that to a historical level of say 3%, and you're talking $2 or $3 trillion. At that point, somebody says, I'm not going to lend to you except at 7 or 8%. And you see how quickly you get into a hole that you can't get yourself out of. So Kent's right. The problem is still on the horizon. It's not immediate, and our system has a lot of problems dealing with things, crises that are immediate. We act very, very well in immediate crisis, whether it's post 9/11 or the meltdown of 2008. But we came close with Simpson Bowles, and Kent was very understated when he said the reason we got the Simpson Bowles bill forward was because he refused to do something for the president that the president needed, and he leveraged the president of the United States into supporting it, setting up with the commission. But the fact is we came close with that proposal, and we really need the leadership that drives that type of a bipartisan effort again, because you cannot do Medicare reform, Social Security reform, and tax reform that's substantive and actually leads to deficit, reducing the deficit unless you do it in a bipartisan way, and it does require, in my opinion, that it be outside the regular order of Congress.
So I think just to introduce some budget dynamics here in our chart-free zone. If we had the charts, all three of us would be showing probably that 2/3 of the budget is on autopilot. About half of the budget is a little bit more. I think somewhere around 60% is the entitlement programs, and another 7 or 8% or so is interest on the debt. And as Senator Gregg was saying, it's important to remember that for the past several years we've been adding huge amounts of debt at very, very low interest rates, historically low, and when that gets rolled over at higher interest rates, the interest rates are beginning to go back up now, which is a good thing because it's a sign of a stronger economy, but it also means it has a budgetary effect. So when you look at what the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, projects on interest costs, they're about $300 billion this year, but over $800 billion within 10 years, and that's assuming no sort of spike like Senator Gregg laid out as could possibly happen. You easily could add another $1 trillion to that. But on the growth of the entitlement programs, we're talking there about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are the big three, and they're driven by an aging population and rising healthcare costs. And the rising population you can't do a whole lot about because people like me, aging baby boomers, are here, and can't do anything about that within the bounds of legal and moral norms. So here we are, and so that's going to put pressure on the budget. The other thing is the cost of health care, and you add those things together, and that's the dynamic that shows that those are the programs that are rising faster than the economy, faster than revenues, and so even if revenues are rising along with the economy, eventually they get outpaced by the rising spending, and you have an uncomfortable choice of cutting the heck out of the rest of the government, including national security, or trying to control the growth of the entitlement programs or raising revenues. So those last two things are things that are kind of on the political agenda right now. Healthcare was on the agenda for most of the year, and will probably come back again at some point, and the tax reform debate is about to begin. So I thought maybe we should look a little bit under the hood at those two issues. Maybe starting with the post-mortem on the healthcare debate. My opinion, just to sort of tee it up, has always been a little bit that whether you're for Obamacare or against Obamacare, the debate was maybe not driven by the things it should have been, which is how do you control the underlying growth of healthcare costs, no matter who's paying for it. And somebody want to begin on the healthcare debate? What should we, when we resume on the healthcare debate, what should we be talking about?
Well, first, I hope we can get some questions from the audience, but these are two big issues that could take a little time. Obamacare, in my opinion, was fundamentally flawed by the way it was passed. I mentioned that earlier. It was passed on a partisan basis, so Republicans generally and a large percentage of the American population didn't trust it coming out of the box. Plus, it created a rather dramatic expansion in a way that I didn't think was necessary in subsidized benefits. For people who didn't really need subsidized benefits, and for other folks who it could have been dealt with much more effectively, in my opinion. The goal was to basically cover the 44 million people who were uncovered with health insurance, but they were not a monolithic group. About 20 million of those folks were people between the ages of 25, 21, at that time 21, and 40, who opted out of the healthcare system because they felt invincible and they didn't think they needed healthcare. They wanted to spend their discretionary funds on something else. And I believe we could have handled that group of people with a national catastrophic plan. So if somebody fell off their motorcycle, they would be taken care of. But if they had regular types of illnesses or health issues, they'd have to handle them themselves. The balance, I think, should have been done by turning the Medicaid dollars, instead of forcing the states into a Medicaid straitjacket, giving the states radical flexibility on how you deal with Medicaid. But that's water over the dam. And now what we have to do is get a hold of the cost of Medicare. And the way you do that is we have to shift our healthcare system just from 50,000 foot. What you got to do is shift the healthcare system from being a cost-plus system, which it basically is and still is and shouldn't be, to a system that rewards outcomes and quality. It's very doable. It has to come up, in my opinion, from the bottom. A lot of the good work on this is being done at the Dartmouth Institute, which is the health policy center at Dartmouth, Hitchcock. And it's been shown beyond question that there are certain delivery systems in this country which are much more cost-effective and much higher quality. They've studied all sorts of procedures over 20 years. And one example is knee replacement. In Florida, it'll cost you 3 or 4 times what it costs you in Minnesota, but your outcomes will be less as far as quality than Minnesota versus Florida. So that's a very broad brush. We could go on for hours on this issue. So I'll just pass it on and hope to get some questions.
Okay.
So absolutely, healthcare is 1/6 of our economy, right? 17% of GDP is healthcare. So it's 1 in every $6 in our economy. It's one of the fastest growing parts of the budget. It's got to be dealt with. Obamacare intended to, as Judd said, expand coverage, which it did. It accomplished a substantial expansion of coverage. What it didn't succeed in doing was controlling costs. And what I used to say to my colleagues is 5% of Medicare beneficiaries use half of the money. 5% use half of the entire Medicare budget. So we ought to focus on that group with a laser. And what would we learn looking at that group? How is it that 5% of the people use half of all the money? They're the chronically ill. They're people with multiple serious conditions, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, etc. We do a very poor job of coordinating the care of that group. Let me just give you an example. In my father-in-law's final illness, we went to his kitchen table, got out all his prescription drugs. He was taking 16 prescription drugs. I get on the phone to the doctor, I go down the list, I get to the second one, he said, oh my God, he shouldn't be taking that, he shouldn't have been taking that for the last 3 years. I get down a little further in the list, he said, well, he shouldn't take those 2 drugs, they work against each other. I said, Doc, how does this happen? He said, it was very simple. He said, your father-in-law has a heart specialist, he got a lung specialist, he's got an orthopedic specialist, he's getting pharmaceuticals down at the corner drugstore, down at the beach, he's getting a mail order, he's sick and confused, his partner is sick and confused, we've got chaos. I bet you every person in this room has seen that in their family. When we were done, we reduced the 16 drugs to 8. One of the biggest causes of hospitalization in this country is adverse drug interaction. And we've created a lot of it by our system. Our system is siloed. It doesn't coordinate well. It doesn't communicate well. So to me, goal number 1 ought to be with the chronically ill, the 5% who use half the money, we ought to have a system of coordination of care second to none in the world. We did this with 20,000 patients and we had huge savings. Not only did we save a lot of money, in fact we saved over $100,000 a patient. Put a care coordinator in every case. But you know what else? We got better healthcare outcomes. Because you eliminated the duplicative test, you didn't eliminate, but dramatically reduced the amount of adverse drug interaction. So there's a huge opportunity here. And Judd is also quite right, delivery system reform. You go around, in my state of North Dakota, to take care of a Medicare patient costs 20% of what it costs to take care of a Medicare patient in Florida. How is that? And the outcomes are better in North Dakota. How is that? I'm not suggesting there's fraud in Florida. But you know what? There's fraud in Florida.
Yeah. All right, so we'll go to questions now. Chase has the microphone.
I'm going to start over here on the left side, or your right side.
Our right side.
My question is really about the process of securing approval, and I think one of the brilliant things both of you have done previously is advocate for a BRAC-type approach, that is vote up or down, not allowing amendments, given which I think provides cover for individuals in both parties to say, well, I didn't like 49%, but I like 51%. Can you talk about whether that's the only way going forward on some of these really tough issues we're going to be able to get approval, or why that may not work?
This is what we came up with on this plane. We actually fashioned our bill after BRAC. And the reason is because if you give people the right to offer an amendment, after you've had a commission that's been populated by people who know what they're doing and theoretically are balanced in their political views, which our commission was. And it was interesting, the final vote on that commission, we had the 3 most conservative members of the Senate on, fiscal conservatives on it, and they all voted for it, and 2 of the more moderate Democratic members, one less than moderate, fairly liberal, voted for it. And so it was a balanced commission. And, but the point is, if you allow amendments on complex issues, a person will offer their amendment, they'll lose it, and then they won't vote for the bill because they say, oh, my amendment didn't get passed. So you've got to make it a clean up and down vote for them where they can't hide in the corners of amendments. And that's why we did it that way.
I entirely agree. It is, to me, the only hope. I was just asked at an event yesterday in Washington. We got to repeat the process. You got to have a commission. You got to have a whole package. It's got to be one terrible vote. One terrible vote. Not a bunch of amendments that people can hide behind and, you know, one terrible vote.
And there's some serious discussion about that, or there was, up until the middle of last summer. There was a group meeting under the auspices of Senator Enzi and Senator Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island. Senator Enzi is the chairman of the Budget Committee from Wyoming. And it was a big group. And Kent and I went and talked to them. Well, about 30 senators there. And we discussed why we had chosen this approach, and there was, I thought, tremendous receptivity to it. But, as Kent said, it comes down to leadership. There was nobody willing to step up, take the lead.
I have a 2-part question framed under the heading of what are we to do? Very shortly we will see the tax reform train coming down the tracks. By all accounts, will significantly increase the budget based on a mythical philosophy that says somehow by collecting less taxes we will ultimately collect more taxes. That was the myth of Reaganomics. It didn't work for Ronald Reagan. It certainly didn't work for Senator Brownback in Kansas, who implemented it and had to go back and reverse it. So given we have this tax thing coming, what are we to do? And then the second part, Senator Gregg referred to the fact that what we ultimately need is leadership. Short of maybe changing how we vote in the midterms in 18 or the presidentials in 2020, in the meantime, as this deficit continues to get bigger and bigger and the debt continues to grow, what are we to do?
You know, educate and organize. That, to me, are the answers. You got to educate people, and that means, you know, in every forum, you got to stand up. You got to ask questions. First of all, you got to know the issue yourself, and then you got to challenge those who are in positions to make these decisions. And you got to challenge them, not in a nasty way. You know, that's part of the problem of our politics today. This personal insult. I mean, we don't need that. We need to challenge people on the seriousness of their answers to questions that really mean something. So we got to educate people, first of all ourselves, then those who are making decisions about who's going to represent them, and you got to organize. You got to get people who are like-minded and get together and push and be persistent. Persistence pays.
That's absolutely right. And the Concord Coalition deserves great credit for being the voice that's trying to drive that education. On the issue of the tax bill, I served on the Ways and Means Committee. I was the most junior member, so I didn't get to say much. And Reagan Rostenkowski was passed. I drafted the last major tax bill that was bipartisan with Ron Wyden, who was a progressive senator from Oregon. It took us 2 years of negotiation, but we finally got it done. And then that bill became basically the vehicle that was picked up by Simpson Bowles and put on steroids. All 3 of those efforts, which got the rates down to what I thought was a much more thoughtful place, because as a conservative, I believe that you do not want a tax law that causes people to invest to avoid taxes. You want a tax law that causes people to invest to get a return, so you grow the economy through the investments rather than avoiding taxes with the investment. And the reason you get Democratic support on major tax reform, as Ron Wyden explained to me, was that he didn't like all the deductions and exemptions because he thought they were special interests. So he wanted to get rid of the deductions and exemptions as special interest exercises. I wanted to get rid of them because I thought they skewed economic activity. And so we were able to reach this agreement where we got the top rate down, I think, to 28%, 26%, and then Reagan, Ross, and Kelsey was 28%, and Simpson Bowles was either 23 or 25%, because it eliminated all deductions and exemptions, and then it actually took some of the money and reduced the debt. But the reason I mentioned those three is because those were the last three major efforts, and they were all revenue neutral under static scoring, which I happen to think is the starting point. We should begin tax reform. Revenue neutrality with the intention of getting rates way down. But to do that, you've got to really step on a lot of very sacred deductions. And the four big ones are real estate, mortgage and rent deduction, charitable, insurance, health insurance, and state and local taxes. And my view is if you're going to do it by stepping on specific deductions, you got to step on them all equally, because nobody can claim that they're being disproportionately impacted that way. The proposal that's come out from the White House and the folks that are working on this is to just hammer down state and local, which won't survive politically, in my opinion, because they'll claim they're being disproportionately hit. Although from a state like New Hampshire, it makes a lot of sense. Why should we subsidize the profligateness of New York? We don't have a lot of taxes. They have a lot of taxes. They spend it on things which we wouldn't spend it on, and they spend it inefficiently, but we're subsidizing them because their citizenry gets to deduct that. The better way to approach this, in my opinion, is to essentially not take on the individual deductions, do revenue neutrality, but get your revenues by limiting your deductions to 1% of your income. And that becomes a very scalable event. So if you were, say, making $100,000, you might get to deduct 5% of your income. And you can pick charitable, state, local, whatever you want to put it into, but you only get 5%. And you scale it down as you go up in income. And you maintain progressivity, and you get the revenues you need. However, I'm not there, so that's not going to happen.
Well, I wish it would. Next question, we got a couple.
Senator Gregg, in healthcare, you mentioned the need to give states more flexibility in terms of Medicare and Medicaid. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the former Graham, Cassidy, Heller, Johnson bill? And if you were still in the Senate, would it be Graham, Cassidy, Heller, Johnson, Gregg?
I don't remember the bill. What did it do?
It was the most recent healthcare bill. It was the one that created
I
grants
was
for the
thinking
states.
Bill Graham. That's how far back
Bill Graham and Butch.
Actually, I thought it had some good things in it. And one of the good things was that it really created the ability of states to handle their Medicaid money with much more flexibility. And I know that if, as governor of New Hampshire, or if John Lynch or Chris Sununu were governor, or Maggie Hassan, if we had the money and we had the flexibility, we would deliver a lot more health care to a lot more people, a lot better, and a lot less cost. And so it had super waivers in it, essentially, and I think that that's very important to the Medicaid. Now, and I'm sure North Dakota would too. There are states where you can see where the government, maybe the federal government has to be involved. But for a state like New Hampshire, total flexibility on the use of Medicaid money would give us a dramatic improvement in how we delivered care to people who were at the economic margin of being able to afford it. I think. What are your thoughts on that?
Go ahead.
I would have been strongly opposed to that bill. Although I also believe states ought to be given more flexibility in managing Medicaid, because I can tell you my state, I mean, I just gave you the numbers on Medicare. It costs 1/5 to take care of a Medicare person in North Dakota than it does in Florida. There's a lot of abuse going on in this system, and it's not just in Medicare, okay? So, but there are other parts of that legislation I would have strongly opposed. That the Medicaid cuts were true draconian, and it also not very satisfying in terms of dealing what I see as the fundamental problems of our healthcare system. That was the siloing of the system, the lack of care coordination in the system, to get at this item I mentioned before, where 5% of the people are using 50% of the money. For the life of me, I don't know why that isn't the focus of our healthcare reform effort. Half the money, 5% of the people.
Okay, we've got just about 2 or 3 minutes left. So Chase, what I think maybe we could do is take a couple of questions, and without answers, I mean, we'll get the answers. I was saying just take,
No
find
answers.
out what the question
Just
is.
questions.
Well, we should have answered.
Thank you. So when I work with people, I try to get agreement around why are we here and what kind of outcomes we're looking for. And one of the problems that I see in healthcare, I mean, I've been in the business, hate to say it, for 40 years, but the bottom line is that we don't, and I'm looking for your opinion on this, we don't come up with a general understanding around the fact that we are in a capitalistic society, whatever that means, and that productivity is the pivot. And you have to have a productive population from womb to tomb. And so if you start out with a basic premise that productivity requires a healthy population, that's the strategic aim. And then you look at the principles involved. And where I find so frustrating, to be quite honest about it, is that there is a tactical approach to just about everything. And so we never get to the promised land, and we don't really tackle the bigger issues because we don't really discuss what they are.
Okay, could we focus? Is that a comment to react to?
Well, so my point of it is tonight we heard, different ways to address a problem, all right? What's the problem you're going to solve? That's the issue.
And there's
And
a
what's
question
the
that
strategy?
So it seems a lot of the budget deficit is from overspending and fraud and things like that. But correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the economy is grown by spending. The problem that we face now is a lot of Generation Y and millennials were swimming in student loan debt. The 2.5 trillion debt between federal and private loans. So we're not able to spend money. We're not able to buy houses. We're not able to put money back into the economy. Now, how big of a role is this really playing in the overall debt? And then to kind of piggyback on that question, is it even possible in a generation to reverse this debt? And I mean, we haven't been debt-free as a country in 200 years, but still, is it even possible?
Okay. Either comments?
Well, let me take the last question first. So I don't think the goal needs to be debt-free. I think the key is to have a debt that is sustainable. And to me, when you are a gross debt of 100% of GDP, you're not sustainable. You need to be probably 30 points lower, which would mean 70% gross debt, publicly held debt of about 40% of GDP. That to me should be the goal. On the gentlelady's question, what's the goal? To me, on healthcare, it's quality, affordable care. I believe that the goal should be universal coverage. I don't personally believe that it ought to be coverage provided solely by the government. I don't think it should be government-run healthcare. When we were in the healthcare debate, I read a book called The Healing of America by T.R. Reid. T.R. Reid used to be a reporter for the Washington Post. I think he was at the New York Times as well for a time. T.R. Reid, The Healing of America. I strongly recommend this book. He went all around the world interacting with the healthcare systems of Germany, France, Switzerland, UK, Canada, Japan, US. And my conclusion, he also showed the statistics on healthcare outcomes of all those countries. My conclusion from his book was, number one, universal care. Absolute important principle. Because the truth is, we provide care to people in this system even now, even if they don't have coverage, but we do it the most expensive, least effective way, through the emergency room. Number two, that it not be government run, that it be a system of private insurance, but not for profit. Not for profit hospitals, not for profit insurance, and that it be a system where the government role is limited to help two things. One, helping people who can't afford the insurance themselves, because there are a group, it's about 15% of society, simply can't afford health insurance on their own. So to me, the government role should be that. Second role for government should be interceding in places where the markets don't work. And I believe area number one is pharmaceuticals. And we've got pills now that cost $1,000 a pill, and you got to take them for 8 weeks. Harvoni, Sovaldi, you look at those medicines, they work beautifully, 99% cure rate, but it costs $100,000 in this country. If you go to Egypt, it costs $1,100 for the same course of treatment. You know, it's just not sustainable.
Well, this is where we part ways, and that's why we had charts. But the basic theory is the same. Affordable, quality health care that's available to all Americans. That's the goal. I have a very deep suspicion of having the government run health care in a universal way. And I don't think Kent was saying that. I think if you look at nations which have single-payer systems, what they end up with is rationing and a stifling of innovation. The great strength of the American healthcare system is the extraordinary innovation of our system. We're the place where most of the good pharmaceuticals are coming from, where most of the procedures are, we are in the biomedicine corridor of the world right here around Boston. And breakthroughs are occurring everywhere, genotherapy, everything. But it's very expensive to do that. And if the government takes over that type of research, it's going to stifle innovation, in my opinion, because the government isn't very good at managing things that require risk-taking and people being entrepreneurial. And you can't get, in the pharmaceutical area especially, but even more as the biomedicines come into play, you can't get investment in those therapies without capital. And capital flows to where it gets a return. And if there's no return, because everything would be for profit, then as a practical matter, you're not going to get the investment in the innovation. That capital is going to flow to electric cars or to doing something else in Silicon Valley. So I do think you have to keep a very robust capital market, and the way you do that is to give people a reasonable return on investments in breakthrough research. And it costs $1 billion, and it takes 12 years to bring a drug to market in this country. And so it takes a lot of capital to do that, and most of them don't come to market, they fail. That's why you get such a high number. So I guess I have a little philosophical difference there, but the goal is the same. And I agree with the government has a responsibility of taking care of the people who simply can't afford to buy health care because of their economic situation. Totally agree with that. But I think the problem is, as a legislator, or a former legislator, do we think we can answer these questions with a broad brush? You know, we can take a brush and sweep it over and come up with the answers. You can't. Healthcare is a constantly mutating, growing, changing undertaking. Every day, something changes in healthcare that changes the delivery system, that changes the quality, that moves people from invasive surgery over to taking medications. And when the government comes in and tries to settle it all out with a one-size-fits-all or a broad brush, it tends to stifle that. And it also probably undermines the quality in the end. So I happen to think you have to empower the forces who are on the ground to do things better by giving them incentives to do better quality at a lower cost. And then you let the forces on the ground evolve the procedures for delivering the care. But again, it's incredibly complex, and I don't want to say that that's the single only answer to it.
The only thing I would say about that, the last question is, yes, I do think it's possible, or I wouldn't be doing this, still doing this. That'd be crazy. After 25 years, no, I think it's possible. It's essential that we turn our attention to that, particularly in the next election. And of course, New Hampshire has a key role as a veteran of presidential candidates. I have to say, we didn't do a very good job collectively of making fiscal responsibility an issue, and I'm looking around at some of our key volunteers that are sitting right in front of me and off to the side here, and I include myself in that. I guess we didn't do our job there, but I think that in 2020 it's quite vital that we make fiscal responsibility more of an issue, and it is particularly important for younger people, and I invite all to get involved, and that gives me an opportunity to throw things back to Chase Hageman, who would be happy to take names for anybody that wants to volunteer for our upcoming effort to make fiscal responsibility an effort. But I also want to thank our two speakers, because you can see why I was never more optimistic about getting something done when they were at the helm of the budget committee, and I wish you were back there now, but I feel good for you that you're free, so I hope
Free at last.
free at last.
Yes, so first of all, I'm Chase, once again, and happy to talk to you more about how you can get more involved with what Concord is doing. And I wanted to say a special thank you to our distinguished speakers, Senators Gregg and Conrad, and Concord's own Executive Director, Bob Bixby. I thought it was a fantastic conversation. Certainly want to thank the Institute of Politics at Saint Anselm College. This is a beautiful venue, and I really appreciate you guys letting us come here for this event under the great guidance of Neil Levesque and Ann Kamen, with a lot of help from their ambassadors, many of which are in the crowd today. And thank you very much for being here to celebrate Concord's 25 years and to talk about really important issues for current and future generations. So thank you very much. That concludes the event.
See you later, Boston.